Our first reading this morning is a poem, a brief poem by the poet James Crews called Follow Your Grief. Everyone says to follow your bliss, but what if some days you need to pull the shades, draw the covers over your head, and turn toward grief instead? What if sadness calls like the one candle left burning in a room with its blackened wick, its scent of struck matches, and flicker of long-gone breath? Joy is the fire we are taught never to deny, but why not see sorrow as elemental too? Plunging both hands deep into that rich black soil in which anything might grow. The assigned Bible reading for this morning, it's a little bit of a longer one, but it's so full of pathos. I love it. It's also got some very old cultural expectations, which we'll hear for what they are. But this is the opening of the book of Ruth. Long ago, when judges governed Israel, a famine swept over the land. So a family from the town of Bethlehem, ironically in a famine, the town is named House of Bread, in Judah, a woman and man and their 2 children emigrated to the region of Moab. The man was named Elimelech, the woman's name was Naomi, and their 2 sons were named Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem of Judah. They arrived in the land of Moab and settled there. Soon afterward, Elimelech died, leaving Naomi and the 2 sons to fend for themselves. The 2 sons eventually married 2 Moabite women whose names were Orpah and Ruth. They had lived in the land of Moab for about 10 years when both Mahlon and Chilion died. Now that Naomi had lost both her children as well as her husband, she prepared to take her daughters-in-law and leave the land of Moab and return to her homeland, for she had heard that God had visited the people by providing an abundance of food. So she and her 2 daughters-in-law left the house where they had been living, and she set out on the road to Judah. But Naomi told each of her daughters-in-law, "Return to your mother's house. May the Most High care for you with the same kindness that you have cared for your dead and for me. May the Most High give you security and true fulfillment and lead you to new spouses." Then she kissed them both. But they wept loudly and said to her, "No, we want to go back with you to the land of your people." Naomi said to them, "Go back, my daughters. Why do you want to come with me? I don't have any more sons inside me to give you as spouses. You have to go back, my daughters. I'm too old to marry again. Even if I told you that there was still hope for me and I had more sons, would you wait until they grew up so that you could marry them? Would you refuse to remarry now for this far-off hope? No, if you did that, it would tear me apart, for the hand of the Most High has been raised against me. Live your life," in other words. And once more they wept loudly. Then Orpah kissed Naomi and returned to her people, but Ruth stayed by her side. Naomi said to Ruth, "Look, your sister-in-law has returned to her people and to the God of her ancestors. You must go also. Follow your sister-in-law." But Ruth said, "Please don't ask me to leave you and turn away from your company. I swear to you, where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. Where you die, I'll die there too, and I will be buried there beside you. I swear, may God be my witness and judge, that not even death will keep us apart." Seeing that Ruth was determined to accompany her, Naomi said no more. We were young once, young and fresh-faced. That's true of every single one of us here. Some of us are still young and fresh-faced. I won't highlight them. I know they don't like to be the center of attention. But I mean, we 19 clergy, each of us who was serving our first congregation, representing various denominations, hailing from all of the corners of this country. It was September 2004, and we'd been flown in from all of these corners. We'd been flown into Atlanta and then driven an additional 3 hours or so into the mountains of western North Carolina to the Hinton Rural Life Center, which is United Methodist Retreat Spot, and as far as I can tell from their website, survived Hurricane Helene. We were there for what was called the First Parish Project, which aimed to create cohorts of young clergy who would learn from and with one another, each other, maybe even helping to beat the 50% dropout rate from the clergy. That's the national average. We would be there for 6 week-long retreats with each other over the course of 18 months, regular small group conversations in between. My small group held our conversation on AOL Instant Messenger, which no longer even exists. I told you, we were young once. Ours was the second cohort. We got along fabulously. So well, in fact, that we managed to get a little bit of grant money to fund a retreat for ourselves the year after the program ended. And then we self-funded retreats annually for 6 or 7 or 8 years. I lost count. We built a tighter bond than any of the other cohorts. Part of that was probably just dumb luck, the right mix of personalities and temperaments in the room. Part of it was because our very first week together, we came on the grazing edge of a hurricane. It came close enough to give us a little bit of fear, but not so close that there was any actual trauma. But still, we did lose power, which forced us to improvise, which was another word for bond. Part of it, I think, was also the fact that we could sing. Not all of us, but enough of us that we could fill a room with voices like angels and harmonies that make the world spin on its axis. I exaggerate a little, I suppose, but it was powerful. We didn't beat those odds. About half of us still left congregational ministry, but we more than filled the unspoken goal of the program, which was to create lifelong friendships. Friendships that are more like family. To the extent that for the last, I don't know, again, I've lost count, 12 or 13 or 14 years, those of us who have lived in this area have gotten together nearly every week to have dinner with each other. Emily was the first one of us to die. The only one so far. Many of you know this story already because you've sat with me and heard me tell it. Early last year, a mammogram turned up a couple of spots that her doctor was very concerned about. So they did some further tests, and it was, I don't know, a quirk of timing. It was just before Ash Wednesday that my phone rang, and I picked it up, and Emily was weeping and said, "Kipp, I have cancer." I'm not a great cook. I made the best soup that I know how to make, and I took it over to the house so that she and Daniel and their daughter Maggie would have something to eat that night if they could. And that began 10 months of aggressive treatment. Aggressive, awful treatment. Chemo, radiation, a double mastectomy, trips to the ER when things got too hard to manage and too terrible. I think of Emily now every time that I donate platelets. 10 months of bodily indignities in a body that didn't treat her kindly in the first place. And then it was over. On January 16th this year, she died. I shared this grief, my grief, not because it's unique or special. I think we heard that it is not unique or special. We see that it is not unique or special. I share it because it's not. I mean, yes, every grief is unique to the person holding it, and it reflects a loss that is special to the people who are experiencing it. But grief is also a universal experience. Grief is alive and goes before you. If you haven't met it on the road yet, you will. If you've met it on the road already, you will again. Anyone who tells you otherwise is lying. And any faith that tells you it doesn't hurt like hell, hollow. Grief is the bill that comes due from loving and being loved, from being alive. How you hold that grief, your grief, how you carry it, how you name it, how you interact with it, that's up to you. And there's not one single right way to do that. That's actually one thing that I love about the story of Ruth, which is a story whose beginning is just saturated in grief. A woman and her family leave their homeland because of famine. Her husband dies. Her sons grow up and marry, and then they die, leaving 3 widowed women to care for each other, which leads to this poignant departure scene in which the older woman, Naomi, decides to return back home and tells the daughters-in-law, live your lives. Go back to your families of origin. Try to get a do-over. One does. And there are tears all around. And I can't help but notice that Orpah's leaving Naomi to go back to her family is every bit the act of love that Ruth's following Naomi is. One acts in love by staying with her fellow bereaved. The other acts in love by heeding that fellow bereaved's wishes for her. There's not one way of doing grief. Doing it is the way. And knowing that others will do it for us, which maybe gives us a little more cause to be reflective and to embrace our very aliveness in ways that are courageous. When I think of Emily, I think of how loud she was, both how she spoke and how she laughed. She was physically small and she was disabled, but she wasn't going to let that make her invisible. I think of how she'd sometimes repeat the ends of your sentences when you were talking with her, almost speaking alongside of you, as if demonstrating that she was hanging on your every word, especially when the conversation was deep and important. I think of how she'd cuss me out when I teased her about that. I think of how she moved her congregation in Glenside to think about the accessibility of their space, so that their disabled priest didn't have to be manhandled up onto the stage every Sunday morning when it was time to preach and lead the liturgy. I think of how I got to manhandle her across the beach and up and down countless sets of stairs. I think of how pissed off she would get when people tried to treat her like a superhero just for being disabled. When she said, just let me be a human, a regular human. But I think of how gentle she was even when she was pissed off about that, most of the time. I think of how she was girding herself to challenge her final congregation and some of its members on their deeply ingrained sexism and homophobia, and how she was thinking about ways to help them loosen their anxious grips on their deep pockets. She was a damn good priest. And what of your beloveds? When you think of them, what is it that you think of? What sticks with you? What can you still feel tingling on your skin? Or what can you still smell in your nose? What still plays across your memory? What do your ears still hear? What is it that you want to keep alive in the world and in yourself? There's a very short Raymond Carver poem that I shared here during Advent of last year. Not coincidentally, I also spoke about Emily in that sermon when I read it. And then I read the poem when I preached at her funeral as well. And so clearly, this poem and my friend are now inseparable in my mind. I also think it's a good time for us to hear it again as we remember our saints and those who have shaped us and are shaping us still. It's called Late Fragment. Raymond Carver, the short story writer, he published it just before he died at the age of 50. There's a hint, just a hint, of regret in it. Maybe it's the regret of dying early, or maybe regret over things said or unsaid, things done or undone. But the regret barely registers in the face of the overwhelming sense that life is a gift, that it's all been worth it, and that love has been what it's all about. He writes, "And did you get what you wanted from this life? Even so, I did. And what did you want? To call myself beloved, to feel myself beloved on the earth." As we hold our saints in this space, as we have said their names and named their names to ourselves, as we remember their faces and call their voices to memory, may we hold on to every moment that we shared, and when we shared that sense of belovedness. Even our complicated saints, our cantankerous ones. May we be in touch with that which they called forth in us, even if that was simply to remind us how we don't want to be. Most of all, may this cloud of witnesses that surrounds us now, in our naming and in our remembering, may they remind us that life is short, and we must never forget that our truest name is beloved. This is God's good news. Amen.